things that I'm going to share tonight really reflect that experience, the things that I've learned in doing this for 30 years or so. And I've been a coach for about half of that time. Also, it's really important to me that as we go through the things I'm going to talk about tonight, that I try to keep this simple for you, right? Not have it become overly complicated. And we're also going to do some things tonight. We're going to go through a dynamic warm-up, and I'm also going to share some things about core stability. We'll review that, in fact, and I'll share a movement with you that, that we've developed here in our lab. So basically, these are the topics for this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about running as it relates to form and technique, movement quality, which I'll discuss in more detail, and stability, stretching and flexibility, things like that, that are the foundation for your running. Not just your running, but everything you do as an athlete. Then we'll talk about the training aspect of running a little bit, and we'll go through that dynamic warm-up as well. What is important to remember is I know you all want to get out of here on time tonight, so I could talk for hours about these topics, but we may not have time to cover them all. So it's important to me that you all are very vocal. Let me know what you want to learn about. We'll save time for questions. And I also want to give you an opportunity, if you haven't yet, to run in the True Form Runners. And I can talk about those at length as well, too. So we'll touch on the things that are most important, try to answer your questions, and give you a few things to work on as well. Sound like a plan? So everything we do here at Pursuit, everything I've learned in those 30-plus years of running is about movement quality. What does that mean? In a nutshell, your body's got to be balanced. If you're imbalanced, your risk of injury is really high, and your ability to get better is reduced. Movement quality, in effect, is the foundation for everything you should do as an athlete. One of my mentors is well known for saying, don't put fitness on top of dysfunction. So if there's something about your, if you have a pain, or if there's an issue that you're fighting, or if there's a weakness that exists, or compensation, whatever it may be, the point of the story is simply that if you try to add fitness to that dysfunction in some way, shape, or form, your ability to get better and to avoid injury is going to be reduced. Now, why do I start out by talking about injury when we talk about running? 7 out of 10 recreational runners in a calendar year are injured. There's very few guys that I trained with in the early and mid-'80s that are running now. They're all either riding their bikes or playing golf, or neither, right? You mentioned the knees. Why? Because through those years, I paid close attention to movement quality, to staying functionally strong and balanced, to making sure that if I needed to stretch more, that I chased that. If I needed to be stronger, I chased that. Always seeking balance. How many of you in your daily lives understand that when you lose balance, bad things happen? You don't talk to your spouse, that gets out of balance. You don't communicate with a coworker, that gets out of balance. Your car runs out of oil and there's imbalance in the engine. Problems, right? You get my point. Appropriate mobility and stability. It's not compensated or dysfunctional. It's a moving target. I often say to athletes, you could present to me right now as balanced and mobile and flexible. Then we could jump in a car and drive to Washington, D.C. And when we got out of the car, this would be super tight. This would be a little like, not so happy. And these babies right here would be turned off. So then you go for a run and you bring that with you into the run. That's what I mean by a moving target. All right, good. So core stability, again, something that is critical and part of that whole movement quality equation. One thing I really want you to understand, and we'll learn about this when we go out and work on a half front plank and a side plank. Core stability is neurological. It's in your brain. So it's not about the size of your muscle. It's not about the strength of a muscle. It's about everything working together. Core stability is the foundation for everything. Before you leave today, you can see a couple of before and after images of some athletes that went through a gait analysis and worked on core stability, and you see dramatic differences in the positions of their hips and pelvis because of changes in their brain and their nervous system, which impacted that stability. If you are not stable, your risk of injury goes up dramatically, and your ability to get faster is reduced. I think this is kind of a cool image because it really represents something that you guys all know intuitively, right? How many of you live in a house or a home? Okay, obvious question. The footings went into the ground, then the foundation. You trust that the guy or gal who put the foundation in knows what they're doing. But how prudent is it to worry about the color of the shutters if the foundation is cracking or if there's a big hole in the ground? Not prudent. And the same thing applies with your body. All right. So we do a whole bunch of different kinds of planking progressions here at Pursuit, and they've been developed out of what we've learned from some analysis. So how many of you have done a side plank before as an exercise? All right, we're going to go review that. How many of you have done a half front plank with a reach? All right, so we're going to review that as well. We consider moving from a side plank to a half front plank and then to the other side as a moving plank, and we program it that way. The key with these exercises, of course, is to do them well. So let's go out onto the floor and let's review some of those in order to get the benefit from them. All right, so Dick, come down into a side plank position for us. So a correct side plank position is one where the body is in a perfectly straight line. I'm going to go ahead and adjust Dick. I'm going to ask him to push his hips forward just a little bit. So it's very common in a side plank to have your hips creased a little bit, oftentimes because of tightness here. That's not what we want. We want a perfectly straight line, one foot on top of another, shoulders in a perfect plane, and that looks like really good form. Let's give that a try. Everybody down into a side plank position. Side plank is one of those really important foundational exercises for running to build that foundation. So that upper arm, just rest it right at your side. Push your hips forward just a little bit. Let's roll the shoulder, no, other way, roll it back. Very, very nice. Okay. If you're having some difficulty being in this full side plank, you can come into a half side plank. Excellent, good. Now, so if you'd like, you can actually bend your knees. Let's go ahead and bend your knees up. Go ahead and lower yourself down. Bend your knees so they're at a 90 degree. Kim, you want to demonstrate that for? Excellent. So we got a lot of twisting going on here. Let's push those hips forward. Excellent. All right, everybody stay up nice and high. No sagging hips. Stay up. How comfortable are we? When you feel like you've had enough, let yourself down and let's roll to the other side. Yeah. All right, let's come up into that side plank on the other side. So the key here is a perfectly straight body line. Make sure to keep your hips pushed forward. Our goal here, and your goal as well, is 2.5 minutes in this position on each side. Raise the hips up slightly for me. Excellent. So if you've not done a half in this position, so we're going to have you bend your knees, come all the way this way. Good. Now raise your hips up from here and push your hips forward for me. Excellent. Very nice. That's it exactly. Can anyone from this position raise the upper leg without letting your hips drop? Very, very nice. Yeah. Tough. Right in this mid-stance position, what's holding up everything on this side of the body is essentially everything on this side of the body. And the plane of motion that's acting on your body is this plane of motion from side to side. Of course, in addition to gravity pushing down on you, which that's one reason why that side plank is such a valuable exercise. Form is really key. I mean, even when I do this, and I've been doing that exercise for a very long time, I always line up in front of a mirror if I can, because it's really easy to cheat, especially if you're tight through here. And if you sit in that position with poor form, you don't glean the benefits from it that you otherwise could. And that's really, really important. Yes?
You said the goal is about 2 minutes.
2.5 minutes is generally what we set as a baseline. Yeah, that's correct. So that's where you really want to get to for each side. And what's important to remember is that it's a difficult exercise. When you start to get to your limit, you may find your shoulders or your back gives way. What we talk about here is to engage our backs in this position and make sure that we're not just sitting on the rotator cuff. So imagine that I'm in this side plank position, right on my side like this. What I do actively is pinch my shoulder blades together, lift my chest, and engage my back. In the kettlebell world, that's referred to as packing the shoulders. So what I've done then is integrate my entire trunk. Now I'm no longer there's just not pressure on my shoulder, but what we've got in effect is a much more integrated, stronger body. So some may find the shoulders give way first, some may find that the hips tend to drop. That's not what we want. Be very, very careful that when you come into the position that everything is tight and tense, and you want to progress it carefully. So don't try to hit 2.5 minutes right off the bat. But if you can add a second or two, do it a couple of times a week, and can be really, really valuable and give you a lot more injury resistance, hopefully, in that, especially in that particular plane of motion. That's an excellent question. As we'll review when we review the dynamic warm-up, we actually believe it's valuable to do this prior to running, because there's a core activation element that comes into play that can be valuable as you embark on your run. And with that being said, in the beginning, I think it's important to do it frequently. You might do it for a few seconds, 10 or 15 seconds every single day. But if there's one day when you go longer and fatigue more, that would also be the day in which you'd want to follow it subsequently with a few days of rest, right? So the longer and harder a session becomes, the more rest is required after that, right? So you may come into it, you may do 30 seconds one day, and then you come back to it the next day, and 15 seconds in, you're really tired, and you just don't feel like you can hold it. That's a red flag that your body's tired, needs to recover a little bit. It's an interesting experiment. If you're not sure how active your core is, give it a try sometime before you run, and then try it again after you run. And you will discover, as I have many times, that you can do much less after the run than you could do before. There's that component of fatigue that really comes into play. Right. James, you want to demonstrate a half front plank? Yeah, so we can also do a plank in a prone position that is really, really valuable for developing core stability. And there are some components here in terms of form that are really, really important. So James is in a half front plank position. By that, I mean he's on his knees and on his elbows. So he's not on his toes, but on his knees. The critical element here is that his butt is turned on. So I'm poking his glutes here, and they are tight. This is where you start, okay? In terms of this exercise, it is a dynamic exercise. In a moment, and you can rest for a second, I'm going to ask him to reach with an arm. And that's the movement that makes this exercise dynamic and very, very running specific. And by the way, very cycling specific and very swimming specific as well. But we want to build this exercise piece by piece. So that's what we're doing. We start with the half front plank position. We contract and keep the glutes tight. It is critical that the hips stay level, perfectly flat, and that as he begins to move his arm, come back up into that position for me. Tight glutes. I'm going to ask him to then reach forward with one arm, and you're going to see no change in movement here. Actually, there was a little bit of a drop of his right hip. So how would he know that if he was doing that on his own? I actually have a dowel across his back. You'll see a bunch of dowels all around here. There's actually one there, though. That's the kayak attachment. But it's a really good idea to lay a dowel right across your back, right in front of the mirror, so that you can see if there's any movement. Oftentimes I ask somebody to imagine that at the end of that dowel is a glass of your favorite beverage. And so as you begin to reach and move, you don't want to spill that beverage. Now you may think, how on earth is this going to help my running? The definition of stability is to stop or control motion in one place in the presence of motion somewhere else. What does that mean for all intents and purposes? It simply means that for you to run well and injury-free, this should be solid. The hips have to be mobile, but the center of your body has to be solid so that these can move freely and easily. If you possess that, then your risk of injury is very low comparatively, and your ability to get faster is high. Okay? One last thing about this exercise. It is easier if your arms are closer together, and much harder if your arms separate. Much, much harder. So as we come into the position right now, let's start with our arms quite close together and our arms parallel. Yes, question? Right. Well, there's a process that you will go through as you learn this, and very often the way we start is I may just ask you, if you find that you go to reach and things twist, right, or you can't do it correctly, we'll start by just pressing one elbow into the floor and lightening the other with no movement, right? That's where we'll start, and alternate one side then the other. You know, it becomes quite difficult to do that and keep everything tight. So we peel it back to its easiest version and build it sequentially. Make sense? It's simple looking and extraordinarily difficult to do really hard, and very dynamic. So alignment is really, really important. A tight butt is really, really important. And only from that foundation should you then progress to the reach. Okay? These are two great exercises that are fantastic to include as part of your warm-up. So a little dynamic mobility work, which we'll review in a moment, and then a little bit of core activation by doing a little side planking and a little half front plank with a reach is an excellent way to turn on your core and activate. And what you'll discover is that when you start to run after doing a couple of these, if you do them well, your run feels much, much better right from the start. One other thing that I think is important that I'll add, and then we'll go back in there. When I'm doing these exercises, like many, they become a window into my body. So maybe there's a day next week where you try this exercise and it becomes really hard to do and you're not exactly sure. And then maybe you remember you did a long drive the day before, or it was one of those days where you spent a lot of time at your desk at work. Or maybe you tripped and fell on the ice, or something awful like that. That happened. The difficulty of the exercise is that window into your body that says, you know, I got to be really careful with my run today. Something's not quite working as it should. Maybe I should give it an extra day. Maybe I should take an extra day of rest and come back the next day. The same with the side plank. Does that make sense? These exercises become feedback mechanisms for us about where we're at. Because again, we want to be durable, right? What I hope most for you guys as you progress your running isn't that you necessarily get super fast in 3 or 6 months, but that you're able to do it year after year, that you get better, that you can enjoy a lifetime of running. That's durability, and that's really what I think is most important. So the only way to do that is to avoid injury. Okay? Questions?
Strength more than flexibility.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was going to talk about flexibility. Let me talk about that for a second. So flexibility and mobility are extraordinarily important. In fact, in my world as a coach and here in our gait lab, the rule is mobility first. Mobility first. So again, it comes back to balance. As a coach, when I look at any one of you as individuals, what I want to know is, what's your story? What's your history? Do you love yoga, but but have difficulty with that exercise? Do you hate yoga but find that pretty easy? Would you go straight to that squat rack when you walked in the building? Or would you go straight to the yoga room? So that tells me something about your story. If you want to progress your running and stay healthy, you have to go to the areas in the gym where you don't typically like to be. Because if you're tight and immobile, you are injury waiting to happen. Mobility is number one. Freedom of movement, the ability for your joints to move freely, and flexibility is part of that. Flexibility is the stretchiness of muscle. Everyone is different. How many of you have asked the question or heard the question, is stretching good? Does it avoid injury? And the answer is yes and no. Right? Kim, because I'm familiar with her as an athlete, is highly mobile. So most of the time I tell Kim, we tell Kim, Kim's learned, she doesn't need to stretch a lot. Right? And in fact, if she did a lot of stretching in certain patterns where she's really mobile, her risk of injury would go way up. But what about somebody who's not that mobile? Those people need to do more stretching. Make sense? The hip flexors are far and away the area that is tightest for us. So let's do one stretch that is almost universal for everybody, right? And that is a stretch for our hip flexors. Now, typically, we do this stretch where we elevate the rear foot, but we don't have the ability to do that with everybody. So let's just come into a half kneeling position. Everybody in this position. Now, if you can see me from here, basically what we've got is straight line between the knee, the hip, and the shoulder. That's what you're looking for first. Tuck your chin, have good posture. The second thing you want to do from this position is fire your butt. Tight. So if that butt is tight, you're squeezing it, that in turn neurologically is going to open up the front of your hip. Now from there, keep pressing into the front of your hip. And you should immediately, of course, feel some restriction at the front of the hip. Poke your butts now. Are they tight? Keep that tightness. That's the key with this exercise. Now, as you look around the room, you'll see some that can move very easily into this position without any stress. What's your name? Elizabeth. So, really long hip flexors. I mean, she's not stretched. Right? While others are immediately feeling some restriction. And as I mentioned, we would typically do this stretch. And for those of you at the end of the night that want to give it a try, we would typically do it this way. So when I do it this way, I'm now bringing in the quad as well, right? Some bend in the knee. So I keep this glute tight and keep working through that area. Can also raise this arm and create some length actually on the side you're stretching. Yeah. So now we lengthen that side of our body. We bring our backs into the equation. Yeah, exactly.
Why am I feeling my left hamstring also? Am I doing something wrong?
Well, you could feel it for any one of a number of reasons.
It's just not flexing.
You're flexed here for sure. Yeah. Bring his foot forward just a little bit. You are putting some stretch into that hamstring naturally, and you may have some restriction there. So, couple of common issues with a stretch like this. What don't we want? Right? Bending forward at the waist. You want to stay nice and tall, good posture, lift the chest, lengthen the spine. Reach toward the ceiling. Keep that butt tight. And if you can't tighten it, poke it, slap it. You know the sprinters that are at the start line and they're slapping their quads? They're trying to wake their body up neurologically. So this is a stretch that even if you are mobile is really valuable to do.